You may have seen from Joe Rogan all the way to news sources like Vice talk about the issue of transgender athletes competing in the female division. And then a few months ago, USA Powerlifting specifically was in the news and got more media attention than it ever has in the existence probably of our whole sport because USA Powerlifting said no. They do not allow, not only do they not allow male to female transgender competitors, but they do not allow any transgender competitors with exogenous hormones. And before I begin, I also want to say that if you're not familiar, my name is Johnny Candido. I've been competing in the USAPL since 2011. So I'm definitely coming at this from the perspective of someone who cares about this powerlifting federation first, and any other biases and motivations are far secondary. I also want to get to a few facts before we begin with our special guest. So the first one is that there is no case, right now there's not a single case of a transgender powerlifter dominating. And this is really important because a lot of media outlets have incorrectly said this. And the reason being is that powerlifting is such a small sport with so many categories that someone can win the M1 division, which is 40 to 49 years old, in their state and be the only competitor. That is extremely common. And in fact, the only two cases that have really gotten attention lately with this transgender issue competing in the female division, you can just look up the Wilks of those lifters. And if their Wilks isn't around 500, then it's not a dominant performance. And when I say look up the Wilks, I specifically mean go to Open Powerlifting and then type in their name. That is the best database. It is completely comprehensive. So just about every single powerlifter that exists will be on there. What's really ironic about this is there is a journalist who is a Harvard grad who writes for Quillette who tweeted, imagine dominating like this basically in your first or second meet. And the most ironic part is that my Wilks score was literally higher than that my first nationals meet in 2011 as a teenager. It's incredibly frustrating because this had around 4,000 to 5,000 retweets. And when I personal messaged this person, he said, oh yeah, I just didn't put that much thought into it. It was just a one-off tweet.
Bruh.
Now this isn't to say it's impossible or that then it's not a worry just because it hasn't happened yet. It's just simply a fact that it hasn't. In other sports, there have been some cases that are a little bit more debatable. For example, Laurel Hubbard in weightlifting. And then also recently in track and field, there was a hurdler named CC who just won the Division II national championship and before was ranked 200th to 300th the previous 2 years as a man. The hurdles go from 36 inches to 30 inches, so the height difference can play a big role. A lot of these rules aren't very domain specific, so this is relevant to the burden of proof. So for example, when it comes to volleyball players in the IOC, you can be a male to female transgender athlete competing with women. And of course, there still is going to be that roughly 5-inch height difference on average, which will bring you closer to the average height of an elite volleyball player. Okay, so the second fact that is not debatable, regardless of what your take is on this issue, is that the USAPL does not allow for TRT. This is a very important issue because not a lot of people know this. Even people who talk to me who are involved in the sport, they think TRT is allowed because it commonly is. Under IOC rules, there are exceptions for TRT, but in the USAPL, there is not. And again, this connects back to the principles, because if they did allow for TRT, but then, for example, with female to male transitions, they don't allow for those transgender athletes to compete with men simply because it's exogenous on principle, even if they don't necessarily have an advantage. It's really important to understand the context with what they're working with and if they are consistent. So for the sake of this one area, they are. The third fact to get out the way is that the USAPL has a different policy than the IPF, even though the USAPL is an affiliate to the IPF. So for those who are unfamiliar with powerlifting, if you win nationals in the USAPL, you qualify for the world meet in the IPF. And yet, given that, you can still have different rules for each federation, which I know it gets a little bit confusing. But the IPF defers to IOC guidelines, and the IOC and NCAA both do allow for transgender competitors to compete in either division, male to female or female to male, as long as there's a 12-month period and there are certain criteria met. So it's a key difference to understand that the USAPL and IPF are not eye to eye on this, even though they do feed into each other. I'm very excited about today's video because we have the chairman of TUE for the USAPL. He's also a medical doctor. His name is Kris Hunt. So whether you agree or disagree on this topic, I think he's definitely worth listening to, and his words carry weight within the federation. So without further ado, I'll let Kris take over.
First of all, thanks, Johnny, for having me on your video. It's really great to be on your YouTube channel and to be able to talk about this issue, because I think this is an important issue, and it's obviously a hot button issue not only in the media, but for equality concerns, and in fact it ties into current political issues with the Equality Act that was just passed by Congress, and it's actually going to be going into the Senate in short order. And so the current evidence for the IOC guidelines are somewhat slim. The IOC basically made this decision as kind of a way to get in tune with what's going on in society currently, but didn't necessarily look at the science in depth. So the current IOC guidelines are actually mostly based off a series of 2 studies from Joanna Harper, who is a trans woman and is a part of this committee. The first study actually did not look at elite athletes, and so then that concern was brought up, and she did a rectifying study that looked at elite athletes that were involved with cycling and running over 4 sports. The 4 sports included only 8 athletes, and so the sample size was very small. There were no descriptive statistics run whatsoever. So basically they didn't look at any stats, any p-values, nothing. It was mostly a qualitative look at the data, and they determined that there was a trend for people's running times and cycling times to decrease after the process of transition from male to female. But they didn't necessarily note what that trend meant statistically and what the impact is compared to other XX females. Once testosterone is implemented into the body, that effect never goes away. We know this from animal studies. So if you take animals and take one group and give them basically nothing and then exercise them, and then compare the same group of, it's essentially mice, and you exercise them and give them testosterone, which wasn't in their body, the differences are very large between the 2 groups, which I think we all kind of know. But then if you take the testosterone away and then exercise the animals again, the differences between the control group and the testosterone that was previously given group is actually still very statistically different. And so what that essentially means is that once you acquire a muscle cell, it's permanent. And I think that we know this from the steroid abusers. People get around the steroid tests all the time. It's an unfortunate fact of life. It's unfortunate for our sport in general. But people try to time their steroid abuse with the drug test, and essentially what they're trying to do is maximize the amount of muscle growth that they get before the drug test, and then try to have their urine test be clean, right? But still have all of the benefit of that training. Well, a similar argument could be made from the process of a trans woman then becoming a woman and trying to compete in the female category. It's not intentional like the case with the steroid abuser, but the fact of the matter remains that a trans woman, having gone through any degree of male puberty, would have still conferred that immutable competitive advantage, unfortunately. What we did is look at the international data for the IPF. And we looked at what is the difference between an XX and an XY person. We found it to be 64%. That's substantial. And so we looked at the existing data from other powerlifting journals, other powerlifting studies that showed that the advantage conferred by steroids is 10%. Okay? We also looked at several other studies that demonstrated the disadvantage of an anti-androgen. And that showed to be about 10%, right? So steroids plus 10%, anti-androgen minus 10%. And so through the process of transition, if you're using the minimum IOC guidelines, then you've got a net negative 10% advantage on your total. So you're taking that 64% advantage and only decreasing it by 10%. That's not a lot. And so you're taking, if a woman that were XX taking steroids, their advantage would be 10%. And thus, if you're comparing even a XX woman on steroids to a trans woman, a XX person would theoretically have to take a steroid that would confer a 5 times advantage of that which would be conferred by steroids alone. And so we place a lot of emphasis on what's the effect of steroids. Well, the effect of having had XY puberty is about 64% of that over an XX puberty person, and an XY person having transition, that effect is about 5-fold of what they would have from having taken steroids. So the issue with trans women that I didn't emphasize, I think, enough was the fact that spironolactone is a masking agent for steroids in the drug assay. And so with the work of our pharmacist that's on our TUE committee, we've determined that essentially greater than 5 half-lives to let spironolactone clear out is about 5 days. So our protocol is to require individuals on spironolactone to hold the drug for 5 days before a meet or any potential drug test. Usually it's just before a meet. So if we have a trans woman competing as female category, then we have that person holding their medicine, spironolactone, which is an anti-androgen, for 5 days. You know, in theory, their testosterone levels are going to bounce back at least to some substantial degree, right? That's the reason we're having them hold the medicine in the first place, is because the medicine washes out. So, you know, there's a lot of theoretical advantages to that. The other piece of that is if we don't require trans women to withhold spironolactone, then we're essentially bypassing everybody else and allowing them to have a medicine that could potentially mask everything in the drug assay for steroids. So currently we're looking at publishing 3 studies. So we're looking at publishing the data for athletes that have taken spironolactone through USAPL. We've actually got to go back through and we're looking at whether or not we need to use an institutional review board to look at that data. The second piece is the data that I demonstrated pretty clearly in the National Governing Body meeting, and that is the IPF data. And that's the 17,000 athlete data, essentially, that we looked at. And so basically that data, the end of the story shows that data shows with very good statistical significance that the difference between a male XY person and a female XX person is about 64% on their total. The third study that we're looking at publishing is actually essentially a review article, and this is a collaboration through many, many scientists. And in fact, most of the studies I've collaborated out with Joe Marksteiner for statistics, and then actually a chemist who runs a lot of ANOVAs in his everyday practice of chemistry, and then another biostatistician who requested to be unnamed because he's in a hostile country currently. But so we've collaborated with many, many scientists as well, besides statisticians, including an individual that has an MD, PhD, and has a micro specialty essentially in androgens. Well, thanks, Johnny, for your time. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll respond to them.
All right, that's it, guys. I want to thank Kris for coming on. Hopefully this will reach a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't, and I can use my platform to at least get this conversation going in a productive way, in just a fair way. So make sure to like the video, support the channel. Also, since I won't monetize this video, it's just not worth trying to avoid the topic in order to keep that going. I'll include a link in the description to a $1.99 tip if you found this video useful to just support videos like this. And then maybe I can keep making some videos that realistically will probably just lose me subscribers and not make any money whatsoever and take a lot of time and effort to put together. But I appreciate the support, guys. And that's it, guys. Make sure to like the video, support the channel, subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.
All right.